On a cold March morning, something happened that would change everything. A moment so unexpected that no amount of training could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. Marcus had stood in the same spot for 3 years. Every single day, rain or shine, snow or frost. He was one of the Queen's Guard, one of the most recognizable symbols of the British monarchy. His uniform was pristine, his posture perfect, his face expressionless. But inside, his heart was beating a rhythm only he could hear. This particular morning felt different, though Marcus couldn't explain why. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to shift. He'd learned to trust these feelings over his 10 years of service. They'd saved him before, kept him alert when exhaustion tried to pull him under. Princess Anne was scheduled to visit the ceremonial grounds that day. A routine inspection. She did them often. Marcus had seen her many times before, always graceful, always composed, always surrounded by security. This would be no different, or so he thought. The morning started like any other. The sun struggled to break through the London clouds. Tourists gathered behind the barriers, cameras ready. The smell of hot chocolate and coffee drifted across the grounds from nearby vendors. Children pressed their faces against the metal railings, excited to catch a glimpse of royalty. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. That's what everyone believed. That's what the security teams confirmed in their radios just minutes before. That's what the other guards thought as they stood at attention. But Marcus felt it again, that pull. That inexplicable warning that flooded his body with adrenaline, without any logical reason. If you've ever seen stories like this and felt that rush of emotion, that need to know what happens next, then make sure you're subscribed. Because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you breathless. The kind of moment that separates ordinary days from days that change history. Princess Anne arrived at 10:47 a.m. Her vehicle pulled through the gates with practiced precision. Security personnel fanned out around her. Protocol was followed. Every step calculated. Every movement anticipated. She emerged from the car with the elegance that had defined her entire life. 60 years of public service. 60 years of knowing exactly what to do in any situation. Marcus watched her approach the inspection line. This was where crowds got closest. This was where protocols thinned slightly to allow for public interaction. This was the most vulnerable position in any royal visit. He knew this from the security briefings. He'd heard the officers discuss it. The balance between accessibility and safety was always delicate, always a calculated risk. The princess smiled at the gathered crowds, waved at the children, paused to speak with a group of elderly women who'd waited for hours in the cold just to say hello. Her security team maintained their distance, but never lost sight of her. Everything was going perfectly, and then Marcus saw him. A man pushing through the crowd, not running, not drawing attention, just moving with purpose toward the open space where the princess stood. Marcus had been trained to spot irregularities, to notice the one person who didn't belong. This man didn't belong. His jacket was too heavy for the weather. His hands stayed in his pockets even when he moved. His eyes were fixed on one target, the princess. Marcus couldn't hear what the man was planning, couldn't see a weapon, had no confirmation of threat, but his body already knew. Every muscle tensed, every nerve fired. His hand moved toward his radio as the man stepped closer to the princess. Closer, too close. And then it happened. The moment that would be replayed and questioned for years to come. The moment that nobody could have predicted. Princess Anne noticed him first. Her eyes flickered toward the man. A subtle shift. The kind of movement most people wouldn't catch. But Marcus caught it. He saw her posture change. Saw her hands subtly signal her security team. She was sharp. She'd spent decades in the public eye. She knew when something was wrong. The man reached into his jacket pocket. That's when everything accelerated. What had been stillness became chaos. What had been routine became emergency. Marcus moved without thinking. His legs carried him forward with a speed he didn't know he possessed. His years of training crystallized into a single moment of action. But he wasn't the only one who moved. Princess Anne stepped directly into the man's path. Not backward, not to the side. Forward, directly toward the threat. Her security team erupted into motion, moving to intercept, moving to protect. But she'd already moved first. She'd already positioned herself between the man and the crowd of civilians behind her. Between the man and a group of children who were filming on their phones. Their faces bright with excitement just seconds before, Marcus reached her in 3 strides. The man's hand emerged from his jacket, empty, his face twisted in desperation. His mouth opened, as if to speak or scream. But there was no weapon. There was only a man in crisis. A man who looked like he was coming apart at the seams. Marcus grabbed him. Steady, controlled, no excess force. No aggression. Just the practiced restraint of someone trained to handle exactly this scenario. The man collapsed into his arms almost immediately. Years of whatever pain or crisis had driven him to this moment seemed to pour out all at once. He wasn't a terrorist. He wasn't an assassin. He was just a man reaching the end of his rope. Security flooded the area. A dozen officers in dark suits moved with precision. Barriers were reinforced. Civilians were moved back. But Princess Anne remained exactly where she was. Her composure was unshaken. Her face showed concern genuine, real concern, for the man now being restrained by Marcus and 2 other officers. "Is he all right?" she asked. Her voice was clear, steady, focused on the man's well-being rather than her own. The officers surrounding her seemed surprised by the question. They were focused on security, on removing the threat, on establishing a perimeter, but the princess was focused on something else entirely. She was focused on why a human being had been driven to this point. Marcus held the man firmly but gently. He could feel him shaking, could feel the weight of desperation in his frame. "We've got you," Marcus said quietly. Words that weren't protocol. Words that came from something deeper. "You're safe now." The man's eyes met Marcus's. There was a moment of connection. A moment of understanding that passed between 2 human beings in the middle of chaos. The man began to cry. Real tears. The kind that come from a place of complete exhaustion and despair. Princess Anne moved closer. The security team tensed, ready to intervene. But she held up her hand. She wanted to know his name, wanted to understand his story, wanted to treat this man like a human being rather than a security incident. "What's your name?" she asked, gently. The man's voice came out in fragments. "James," he managed. "My name is James." "James," the princess repeated. "I'm an Anne. And I want you to know that whatever brought you to this moment, there are people who can help you." The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes. But it was a 2 minutes that shifted something in the atmosphere. The panic that had gripped the gathered crowds began to ease. The officers realized there was no continuing threat. The security team understood that their duty in this moment was not to escalate, but to ensure this man received proper care. What they didn't fully understand was why. Princess Anne was speaking to him like she cared. Why she was asking about his life. Why she was treating a man who'd breached security protocol like he mattered. But Marcus understood. He saw it in her eyes. This wasn't about protocol or duty or procedure. This was about genuine human compassion in a moment when the world had stopped. James was led away carefully. Medical personnel were called. Psychological evaluation was ordered. But before he was taken from the grounds, Princess Anne pressed a hand to his shoulder. She said something to him quietly. Something private. Something that made the tears flow harder, but seemed to bring him a measure of peace. Marcus watched her do this, and felt something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a protector. He'd always thought his job was about prevention, about stopping bad things from happening. But maybe his job was something else too. Maybe it was about bearing witness to moments of grace. Maybe it was about seeing people at their worst and choosing compassion anyway. The crowds began to disperse. The official inspection continued, though now it had taken on a different character. The princess remained composed, though Marcus could see the adrenaline still moving through her system. He could see it in the slight tremor of her hand. In the way she breathed a little deeper than before. She'd been afraid to. She'd just hidden it better than most. Within hours, the incident was being discussed in security briefings across the city. The protocols were analyzed. The preventative measures were questioned. The entire sequence of events was broken down frame by frame to understand what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. But there was one conversation that wasn't part of the official record. One moment that nobody but Marcus would ever truly understand. As the princess was leaving the grounds, she pulled him aside. Her security detail maintained a respectful distance, but everyone could see that she wanted to speak with Marcus alone. "That was extraordinary," she said. Her voice was different now, less formal than it had been in public, more personal. "What you did, how you handled it, that wasn't just training." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He was a guard. He did his job. He didn't expect acknowledgement. He didn't expect recognition. He certainly didn't expect the heir to the monarchy to speak to him like he was a person rather than furniture. "I was just doing what I've been trained to do." "Ma'am," he said. "No," Anne said, shaking her head. "You did something more. I watched you. When you reached him, you treated him like a human being. You didn't treat him like a threat. You treated him like someone who was suffering. That came from something inside you that goes beyond training." Marcus felt something catch in his throat. He'd never considered himself anything special. He came to work. He stood watch. He went home. His life had a rhythm to it. A routine. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. He was just a man doing his job. "The man's name is James," the princess continued. "He's struggling with severe depression. He lost his job. He lost his home. He lost his family. He was looking for a way to end his pain. Not to hurt anyone. Just to be heard. Just to matter to someone." This information wasn't available to Marcus through official channels. The princess must have asked the officers, must have demanded his story, must have insisted on understanding who she was really dealing with. "He's being transferred to a psychiatric facility," Anne said. "A good one. And there will be support for him. Housing assistance? Job training. Everything he needs to rebuild." "How did you arrange that so quickly?" Marcus asked. "I made some calls," the princess said simply. "When you see someone at the edge of the cliff, you don't just push them back from the cliff. You help them build a new path. That's what I believe anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. And in that moment, Marcus understood something profound. The people who hold power don't have to use it the way most people assume they will. They can choose compassion. They can choose to intervene not just in the moment of crisis, but in the systems that create crisis. "Thank you," she said finally, "for showing me what it looks like to serve with real humanity. Most people in your position would have done their job and forgotten about it by tomorrow. But I suspect you won't forget about James." Wow. She was right. Marcus wouldn't forget. As the months passed and the incident faded from the news cycle, Marcus found himself thinking about James, wondering how he was doing, whether the support the princess had arranged was actually helping, whether the man had found his way back to something like stability. He tried to find out through official channels but hit dead ends. Privacy regulations. Confidentiality agreements. The systems that protect people also make it impossible to follow up on their progress. All Marcus had was the knowledge that Princess Anne had intervened, that she'd taken a man at absolute rock bottom and positioned him for recovery. What Marcus didn't know was that the princess was doing the same thing regularly, that she had a network of people she worked with. Mental health professionals, social workers, housing advocates. She was changing lives in ways that rarely made the news, in ways that nobody celebrated or recognized. She was doing it simply because she believed it was the right thing to do, but the incident did make one. Major change in the security protocols at the ceremonial grounds. After reviewing what happened, the security team made a recommendation. They suggested that Marcus be promoted, that his instincts, his composure, and his humanity had been an asset in an extraordinarily difficult situation. 6 months later, Marcus received his promotion. He wasn't just a guard anymore. He was a supervisor, a trainer, a person responsible for teaching other officers how to handle situations like the one that had unfolded on that March morning. He started incorporating new elements into the training, elements that went beyond physical response and protocol. He taught officers how to read people, how to understand the difference between a genuine threat and a person in crisis, how to respond to human suffering with compassion rather than just containment. His trainees found it unusual at first. Security training typically focused on threat prevention and tactical response. It didn't usually include lessons in emotional intelligence and compassion. But Marcus proved that it worked. Crime prevention wasn't just about stopping people. It was about understanding what drove them to the edge in the first place. The relationship between Marcus and Princess Anne never went beyond that single conversation. Protocol didn't allow for ongoing personal connection between royal family members and security personnel. But Marcus knew something had changed in how she moved through the world. And he suspected she knew something had changed in how he understood his role. 3 years passed. 3 quiet years where Marcus moved through his daily routines. He trained officers. He stood watch. He lived his life with a new understanding of what it meant to serve. The incident with James became a historical footnote. Something that happened. Something that was handled. Something that the vast majority of people never knew about at all. Then one day, Marcus received an unusual request. He was asked to meet with Princess Anne privately. It happened during a royal visit to a mental health facility that was part of her charity work. The meeting was brief, just 10 minutes, but it contained the information that would change everything. "I wanted you to know," the princess said, "that James is doing well. He's been stable for nearly 4 years now. He's working again. He rebuilt his relationship with his sister. And he credits that moment with you when you held him and treated him like he mattered as the turning point." Marcus felt something release inside his chest. All those years of wondering, all those unanswered questions, suddenly he had the answer. The intervention had worked. The life that had been at the absolute edge of collapse had been salvaged. "He doesn't know I'm telling you this," the princess continued. "Privacy regulations and all that. But I thought you deserved to know that what you did mattered. That the choice you made to treat someone in crisis with dignity wasn't just a nice gesture. It was transformative." There was something else the princess wanted to tell him too, but she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "I've been doing this work for a long time," she said, "using privilege and position to help people that the systems often overlook. And I've learned something important. It's never just about the moment of intervention. It's about what happens after. It's about surrounding people with humans like you, people who see them as people, not problems, not threats, just people who deserve a chance." Marcus understood what she was saying. She was acknowledging that his choice in that single moment had rippled outward, that his treatment of James with humanity rather than just protocol had been part of a larger ecosystem of care that had saved a life. "What happened to James is what I hope happens more often," the princess said. "But it only happens when people choose compassion, when they choose to see the human being in front of them rather than just the role they're playing. That choice you made, that was everything." They spoke for a few minutes longer, but the core of the conversation had already happened. The princess thanked him for what he'd done, for who he was, for showing her that guards could be something more than security. They could be guardians of humanity. After that meeting, Marcus's work took on new dimensions. He continued his role in security, but he also began volunteering with mental health organizations. He started speaking at training seminars about handling crisis situations with compassion. He became someone who understood that prevention wasn't just about stopping threats. It was about understanding human desperation and responding to it with care. Years later, when the incident was eventually written about in historical records and security case studies, it became known as a turning point in how royal security protocols approached mental health crises. The standing protocol shifted from pure containment to something that included assessment and support. Threats were still addressed. Humans in crisis were also treated like humans deserving of support, but the most important impact happened outside the official systems. In the private sphere, in the lives changed by a new approach to security work. Officers trained under Marcus's new methods began preventing crises rather than just responding to them. They began de-escalating situations through communication rather than control. They began saving lives before the moment of crisis ever arrived. 5 years after the incident, Princess Anne was invited to speak at a security conference. The organizers wanted her perspective on the evolving role of security personnel in society. It was an unusual request. Royals didn't typically give professional speeches to security officers. But Anne agreed, and she used the platform to tell a story. She didn't name James. She didn't identify Marcus specifically, though she gave enough detail that those in the audience who'd been there would know. But she told the story of a moment when security wasn't about stopping someone. It was about understanding someone, and how that moment had shifted her understanding of what protection really means. Protection, she said, is often understood as prevention, as stopping bad things from happening. But I've learned that true protection includes something else. It includes responding to human suffering with compassion. It includes recognizing when someone isn't a threat, but a person in need. And it includes choosing to serve their humanity rather than just their role as a security concern. The speech went viral in professional circles. Security organizations began adopting new protocols. Universities started including modules on compassionate security response in their criminal justice programs. What had started as a single moment of choice had become a movement. But what most people didn't see was the private impact. The day after the speech, Marcus received a letter. It was from James. James had seen the speech, had recognized himself in the story, though names weren't used. He wanted Marcus to know that his life had continued to stabilize. He'd gotten married. He'd had children. He'd built a career. Every good thing that had happened came back to that moment when someone chose to see him as human rather than as a threat. The letter was 6 pages long. James wrote about his children, about how he was teaching them to be compassionate, about how, if it hadn't been for the moment on that morning 5 years ago, they wouldn't exist. Their lives existed because someone had chosen compassion in a moment of crisis. Marcus kept that letter. He read it sometimes when he needed to remember why his work mattered. It was a reminder that security wasn't just about preventing bad outcomes. It was about making space for human dignity, even in moments of extraordinary tension. The transformation didn't stop there. Marcus was eventually promoted to head of security for the entire ceremonial grounds. In that position, he implemented comprehensive changes. Officers received mental health training. Crisis negotiators were integrated into response teams. The physical security remained tight, but the human understanding became much more sophisticated. And Princess Anne found an ally in her mission to use royal privilege for genuine change. She and Marcus would meet quarterly to discuss progress on a mental health initiative that had grown out of the original incident. They weren't friends in the traditional sense. Protocol still maintained appropriate distance. But they were collaborators in something meaningful. When I was younger, the princess told Marcus during one of these meetings, I understood my role as being ornamental, as representing something abstract. It took me years to understand that I could actually change things. That with access and privilege comes responsibility to use it for genuine good. That moment with James taught me I wasn't doing enough, that I could do so much more. She was already doing so much more. Her charitable work had expanded significantly. She was working with mental health organizations, housing advocacy groups, job training programs. All of it traced back to a single moment when she'd chosen to see a person in crisis as someone deserving of care rather than containment. But what struck Marcus most was her humility about it. She never positioned herself as the savior. She always framed it as a collaboration. Security officers who'd chosen compassion, mental health professionals who'd chosen to invest time in cases others had given up on, social workers who'd believed that people at the absolute bottom of the well could still climb back up. It's never one person, she reminded Marcus. It's always a network of people choosing to believe in possibility. That's what I've learned. That's what I'm committed to spreading. The idea that how we respond to human suffering matters, that our choices, in moments both big and small, determine whether lives are salvaged or lost. Years later, when the story of that March morning was finally told publicly in full, it became one of those stories that people returned to again and again. Not because it was dramatic in the action movie sense, but because it was dramatic in the human sense, because it illustrated something fundamental about choice, about what we do when we're faced with a person in crisis, about whether we see them as a problem to be managed or a person to be helped. By the time the full story became public, James had lived a complete life for a full decade after that moment. He'd built everything you build when you get a second chance. A career, a family, a purpose. He'd even become an advocate himself. He spoke to young people about mental health, about the desperation that leads someone to the edge, and about the grace of being met with compassion rather than condemnation at that moment. When journalists asked him what he remembered about that day, James was always clear about one thing. It wasn't just the princess's intervention that had saved him. It was the guard. It was Marcus. It was the way a person whose job was to stop threats had instead chosen to hold someone with care. To say you're safe now, to a man who'd been afraid for so long that he couldn't imagine safety anymore. That moment, James would say, that was the moment I remembered I was human, that I deserved to exist, that my life mattered to someone, and that someone was a person I'd never met before, a person just doing his job, but doing it with a heart. Marcus retired from his security role in his early 60s. He didn't disappear from the work, though. Instead, he became a consultant. He traveled to different countries speaking about progressive security protocols, about crisis intervention, about the possibility of building systems that protected people without dehumanizing them. His training programs became models that were adopted worldwide. His writing was published in professional journals. His insights shifted how an entire industry understood its responsibility. All of it started from one choice, one moment, one decision to treat someone in crisis with compassion rather than containment. Princess Anne continued her work until her retirement, and when she finally stepped back from her official duties, one of her final acts was to establish a scholarship fund. The James Foundation, it was called. It provided support for individuals experiencing mental health crises. It provided housing. It provided job training. It provided the ecosystem of care that James had received. But what was most meaningful about the foundation was that it didn't operate from a place of charity or pity. It operated from a place of belief. Belief that people at the bottom of the well could climb back up if given proper support. Belief that compassion wasn't weakness, but strength. Belief that protecting people meant understanding them, not just restraining them. Years later, when journalists would do retrospective stories on Princess Anne's legacy, this foundation was often mentioned. But the story of that March morning, the story of the guard, and the moment of grace, became the narrative through which people understood her entire approach to philanthropy. It was the origin story, the moment that changed everything. For Marcus, the impact was quieter, but no less profound. He'd discovered that his life's work had meaning beyond what he'd ever imagined. That standing at attention every day, that discipline, that commitment to protocol, it had all been preparation for a single moment when the protocol didn't matter as much as the humanity did. Toward the very end of his life, Marcus received one final letter. It was from James's oldest child. She was grown by then. A teacher, someone who worked with at-risk youth. She wrote to tell Marcus that she dedicated her career to youth intervention precisely because of her father's story. Because she'd grown up understanding that compassion could save lives. "My father told me what you did," she wrote. "How you held him when he was breaking. How you said you would be safe. How you treated him like a person who mattered. I became a teacher because I wanted to be that person for other kids. To be the one who sees them as human when the world is trying to reduce them to problems. Thank you for showing my father and showing me that such people exist." That was perhaps the greatest legacy of all. Not the policy changes, not the programs or foundations, but the fact that one choice had rippled outward through generations, that a moment of compassion had become a model for how other people understood their responsibility to each other. The March morning, when a routine royal inspection became something extraordinary, had transformed everyone who'd been present. It transformed how security was understood. It transformed how mental health crises were managed. It transformed how a princess understood her privilege. It transformed how a guard understood his role. And it transformed the life of a man who'd been one moment away from becoming a statistic. All because someone chose compassion. All because protocol was set aside in favor of humanity. All because, in a moment of crisis, people remembered that the person in front of them was a person, not a threat, not a problem, not a security concern. A person, a human being deserving of dignity, deserving of care, deserving of a second chance. That's the story of the royal guard who witnessed Princess Anne's heroic act during a sudden emergency. But perhaps it's more accurate to say it's the story of an ordinary person who did an extraordinary thing by simply choosing to be human in a moment when the world needed humanity. That choice, that single moment of compassion, that's what changed everything.